Welcome to this explainer. Look, let's just dive right into this, because today we're embarking on a totally fascinating and genuinely gruesome journey into the ancient world. We're going to look at the terrifying legends of some of history's absolute darkest rulers, but more importantly, we're going to use the historical record to peel back the layers of these myths. We're digging into the actual source material to uncover the historical truths that have been hidden beneath centuries of rumor, exaggeration, and quite frankly, propaganda. It's going to be quite the ride.
So what happens when absolute power meets absolute paranoia? It's a profound question, isn't it? Throughout history, certain names have basically become shorthand for cruelty and madness. I mean, think of Ashoka the Cruel in India, Qin Shi Huang in China, Emperor Nero in Rome, and Herod the Great in Judea. Their reputations are so incredibly terrifying they almost feel like movie villains. But to really understand them, we have to look past the spooky stories and look closely at the actual mechanics of their power.
Section 1. Legends of Absolute Power.
Section 2. Ashoka's Beautiful Torture Chamber.
Now, the absolutely crucial point in understanding these legends is that history's most infamous monsters were often shaped not just by their own brutal deeds, but by political propaganda. The historical sources we rely on, well, they were usually written by people with very specific agendas, like people who had just defeated these rulers, or maybe folks who wanted to make a theological point. The rewriting of history is an incredibly powerful tool. For example, before Emperor Ashoka of ancient India became known as the pious Buddhist convert, he was actually known as Ashoka the Fierce. According to legendary texts like the Ashoka he constructed something utterly nightmarish in his capital city, designed by an executioner literally named Girika the Cruel. The outside was this beautiful, enticing palace with exclusive baths, flowers, and fruit trees. It was basically designed to make people want to wander inside. But once you were in, it was a literal house of horrors filled with sadistic devices. We're talking furnaces used for pouring molten copper directly down prisoners' throats. Ashoka and Girika supposedly made a dark pact. Absolutely no visitor who entered this beautiful jail would ever be allowed to leave alive. It's a truly terrifying image.
But let's break down the legend versus history here. The legend says Ashoka actually visited Buddhist hell to perfect his torture designs, and that he only finally converted to Buddhism when a monk named Samudra miraculously survived being boiled in a cauldron of human blood and excrement, just meditating peacefully on a lotus flower that sprouted right out of the fluid. Okay, that is an incredibly dramatic story. But historically, there is absolutely zero archaeological evidence of this chamber ever existing. No way. Modern historians actually suggest this whole myth was a theological narrative. It was basically designed to make Ashoka's subsequent conversion to Buddhism seem even more miraculous. By making his past unimaginably evil, his redemption becomes unimaginably great. Make sense?
Section 3. Burning Books, Burying Scholars.
Okay, let's jump over to China and talk about the intellectual purge under Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor who unified the nation in 221 BCE, 460. I want you to remember that striking number. For over 2 millennia, the first emperor's legacy was defined by a specific 4-character phrase, Fenshu Kengru. It translates to, he burned the books and buried the Confucian scholars alive. And the exact number of scholars supposedly buried alive in a pit in 212 BCE? 460.
But we really have to ask ourselves, did Qin Shi Huang actually bury hundreds of scholars alive? Now, the burning of the books definitely happened. He ordered private copies of historical and philosophical texts destroyed to unify political thought. But the live burial part? Well, that requires a much closer look at the sources.
And this brilliantly illustrates how language changes history over time. The historian Sima Qian, who was writing over a century later, used the word king. Originally, this word just meant pit or moat, and then it kind of evolved to mean to trap and kill or annihilate an enemy in battle. Sima Qian even used it elsewhere in his writings just to mean to kill. It was actually only in much later dynasties that king was completely misunderstood to specifically mean bury alive. Furthermore, the victims weren't even Confucians, because that specific philosophical school hadn't even formally crystallized yet. They were most likely scholars or alchemists who had just somehow angered the emperor.
So, looking at the myth versus reality here, the myth tells us he destroyed all historical records and buried 460 scholars alive to crush opposition. But the fact is, he actually preserved 2 copies of every text in the imperial libraries. And ironically, many of those were destroyed later when rebels burned the palace down after his dynasty fell. And that whole burying alive story? Modern scholars point out that the victorious Han dynasty, which defeated the Qin, intentionally used historians like Sima Qian to slander the previous regime. They basically needed to justify their own rule by painting the first emperor as this supreme, anti-intellectual monster.
Section 4. Nero, Artist, Emperor, Monster.
Now we move forward in time to Rome. Nero is arguably the most polarizing figure of the ancient world. Born in AD 37 and taking the throne at just 16 years old, his reign didn't actually start horribly. Under the guidance of his tutor, the famous Stoic philosopher Seneca, his early years were considered a golden period of fair taxation and genuine support for the poor. But man, absolute power corrupted him quickly. In AD 59, totally paranoid about her influence, he orchestrated the murder of his own mother, Agrippina. Yeah. By AD 65, he was forcing his former tutor Seneca to commit suicide. His reign just completely descended into extreme extravagance, culminating in his eventual downfall, his flight from Rome, and his suicide in AD 68.
But the event absolutely most associated with Nero happened in AD 64, the Great Fire of Rome, which brings us to one of the most famous questions in all of Western history. Did Nero actually fiddle while Rome burned? We've literally all heard the phrase.
The popular legend says he intentionally started the fire to clear land for his massive, extravagant golden house, and that he played music as his own people burned. But the actual facts tell a very different story. First of all, fiddles didn't even exist in ancient Rome, so strike one. Second, reliable historical sources like Tacitus note that Nero was actually miles away in Antium when the fire broke out. When he heard the news, he rushed back and actively led relief efforts, literally opening his own private gardens to house the refugees. However, and this is a big however, to deflect the persistent rumors that he did start the fire, Nero made a horrific political calculation. He scapegoated the small Christian minority, leading to their brutal systematic execution. So he may not have played the fiddle, but his intense political paranoia definitely drove him to extreme cruelty.
Which brings us to his final moments. Fleeing his enemies, Nero took his own life, reportedly crying out, "What an artist dies in me." It's crazy, because it perfectly captures his total detachment from reality. Right up to his unceremonious death, Nero wasn't mourning the empire he mismanaged. He was completely obsessed with his own public performance and his artistic legacy.
Section 5. Herod's Horrid Final Days.
Now let's look at a ruler whose paranoia extended even beyond his own death. Herod the Great ruled Judea from 40 BCE to 4 BCE. He was an absolute architectural genius who rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. But his brilliance was entirely overshadowed by his ruthless, paranoid cruelty. To really understand it, you just have to listen to this darkly humorous quote attributed to Emperor Augustus. "Better to be Herod's pig than his son." Since he was a convert to Judaism, Herod wouldn't eat pork, so, his pigs were totally safe. But his family? Not at all. Herod was so consumed by the fear of being overthrown that he executed his own beloved wife, Mariamne, and 3 of his own sons.
And his end was just as hard as his reign. The ancient historian Josephus meticulously recorded the symptoms of Herod's final illness when he was 70. Now, for a long time, people thought Josephus just made up these disgusting symptoms as kind of a poetic justice against a tyrant. But modern medical science maps these ancient symptoms perfectly to clinical diagnoses. An unbearable itch, modern doctors diagnose that as end-stage kidney failure causing waste to build up in the blood. A transparent swelling, terminal edema. Putrefaction creating worms, that's myiasis, which is a very real, horrific maggot infestation in open wounds. Upright breathing, orthopnea, a classic sign of heart failure. So the ancient horror perfectly aligns with relatable, modern clinical reality. The guy was in sheer agony.
But even in this unimaginable physical agony, his paranoia and spite reigned supreme. And this brings us to the infamous Hippodrome plot. Herod knew perfectly well that his subjects hated him and would probably celebrate his death. So, from his literal deathbed, he summoned the prominent Jewish leaders to Jericho and ordered them locked inside the Hippodrome. His final command? Execute every single one of them the exact moment he dies. Why? Because he wanted to ensure there would be genuine, nationwide mourning on the day of his funeral, even if the people were weeping for their own families and not for him. Thankfully, his sister countermanded the order the second he died, and the leaders were released. But it just shows you how absolute power desperately attempts to manipulate even grief itself.
Section 6. The Truth Behind the Myths.
So, what do we actually learn from peeling back the layers of these historical tyrants? Well, we see a very clear common thread. Fake news, political propaganda, and the rewriting of history by the victors are ancient concepts. They are definitely not modern inventions. The myths of boiling cauldrons, burying scholars alive, and fiddling while cities burn, these were all tools used by successors to legitimize their own power. Don't get me wrong, these rulers were certainly ruthless, paranoid, and cruel. The actual historical records of their murders and misdeeds totally prove that. But the extreme caricatures they became were deliberately crafted. Understanding the source of these myths really matters today because it reminds us to always question the narratives we are handed and to look very closely at who exactly is doing the telling.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to ponder. If history is truly written by the victors, what other legendary monsters were merely men? And conversely, what legendary heroes might have had a much darker reality that was just conveniently erased from the record? It really makes you want to dig back into the history books, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.